So, good afternoon, everybody. Just to be sure that we finish this lecture on international migration, I was just mentioning like that micro simulation model. If the US adopts the point system as Canada, it would increase from 52 to 67% the share of immigrants and their descendants with a college degree. Exactly because this is based on the Canadian system that really focuses on immigration, on education of immigrants. But if it was possible to eliminate all unauthorized migrants to the US, that would increase the share with a college degree by just 3%. But we all know that's not really possible to eliminate all unauthorized migrants to the US. And if you eliminated all family and diversity immigrants through the different categories of visa, this will increase the share of those with a college degree only by 1%. And pretty much because family-based and diversity immigrants are nearly as educated as employment-based immigrants. So eliminating this would not make any difference. And overall, what it's emphasized in this analysis is that immigrants, first generation, those that are born outside and come to the US, they might arrive with lower education than the US born population. But children of immigrants, second generation, those that are born in the US and parents born outside, they tend to improve their education. So education attainment of descendants, children of immigrants, tend to move towards the average attainments of the native population. So even if first generation immigrants on average have lower education attainment, their children will improve it. But overall, I mean, the US receives most of the immigrants in the world right now, really large numbers, but immigrants and their descendants usually make up only 20% of the US population, even projected to 2065. And this proportion is too small. Even if these immigrants have lower levels of education, that's not going to change much the composition of education of the American population. And so impacts of eliminating unauthorized immigration or the family reunification and diversity categories on the entire workforce of the US would be virtually zero, would not have any effects. And the main idea is that immigrants, when they come to the US, they do change the composition by race, ethnicity, and also the culture, because they integrate, they bring new food, they bring new habits, and so on. But the impact of education composition is really zero. Education is similar across existing class of immigrants, and mobility among children on immigrant means that mobility among children of immigrants means that their education drifts towards population among immigrants of children. So mobility among children of immigrants means that their education drifts towards population averages. So children of immigrants, those that their parents are low educated, they will tend to have an upward mobility. They will tend to have better education than their parents. But children of immigrants, in which immigrants have higher education, on average, actually their education will decline because children of immigrants tend to have an overall average of education attainment similar to the US-born population, right? So some children of immigrants, their parents are better educated than the overall population in the US. So those children will train on average to decline, have a downward mobility. And those children that come with parents with low levels of education, they will tend to improve, have an upward mobility. But overall, because migration represents a small share of the population, though the education attainment of immigrants is not going to change the overall composition of the US labor force in terms of education. So those policies that try to change the US system, immigration policy system, into the Canadian system actually is not going to have the effect that the current administration is saying. It's not going to change anything in terms of education attainment of the whole population. Exactly because of some children of immigrants will get better, some will get worse, tending towards the average of the US population, and one kind of nullifies the other. And before I go into the lecture of internal migration, what I suspect at the end of last class happened. We had a quiz 15 last Thursday, and a total of 49 respondents answered by the deadline, which was the following day by noon. So it was 69% out of 71 students. But you remember that we had only 3 students in the classroom. At the end of the class, we had only 17 students, but when I looked in the Zoom, 22 students in total logged into the class at some point, and 5 students viewed the class on YouTube before the deadline of quiz 15. So a total of 30 students watched in some way the lecture, and 49 answered the quiz. I saw many grades equal to 0 on quiz 15, because it's not possible to make miracles if we are not studying and watching the lectures, right? Another thing is that our next exam, exam 3, is 2 days from now, November 5th, Thursday. And that's what is it in the syllabus. And the content of exam 3 is going to be exactly what I'm showing here. It's going to be mortality chapter, chapter 7, starting from the life table, because we covered up to standardization on exam 3. So if we just go into the mortality lecture, it's going to be life table, short history of mortality in the world, mortality trends and cause of death, mortality longevity in the US, infant mortality, future course, and coronavirus pandemic. All that will be covered on exam 3. International migration, also all material that we cover. And remember, the material is not just what is in the chapter, but it's also what I added into the slides that are not in the chapter, because those are extra readings and that I added into the lecture. The internal migration chapter is the one that I'm going to start today. A lot of the points that I'm going to cover today, I already covered before since chapter 2 and also in chapter 7, so I might go faster in specific slides. But overall, in whatever place of the lecture I stop today, that's going to be the final topic that we're going to cover on exam 3. So exam 3 is going to go from chapter 7, mortality start on life table, and going until whatever topic we cover today. And remember, a lot of the material that I cover in mortality here too, like in terms of life table, it was not covered it's not on the textbook. So it's on the lecture, on your notes, on YouTube. The lectures are all recorded there, right? And, but the life table also, if you remember, there are 2 subsections here. This one that we covered more in detail, and this one, life table extra. This life table extra is really extra, but what I covered more was this portion here of life table, and also the Excel file that I showed how to estimate life expectancy at birth using Excel. And just to remind, so the exam 3 is this coming Thursday, so we do not have a meeting in the classroom or on Zoom. You just take the exam between 1 p.m. and to 8 p.m. on Thursday, but once you start it, you have 1 hour and 15 minutes to answer all 50 questions. So we jumped internal migration, we covered international, now I'm going to go back to internal migration, and exam 3 will cover portion of mortality, internal migration, and portion of international migration, and portion of internal. And any questions? Okay. The internal migration lecture, you can ask questions on chat. I can see chat today. My idea here is to cover these topics here, mostly these 4 topics. This topic about analysis of space association, I'm doing an analysis about internal migration in the US. If we have enough time, I will cover it, even if it's not today, maybe next Tuesday after the exam. But this part here about internal migration in China, I will not cover, right? So in this lecture here, I will go just until analysis of space association. And this discussion about internal migration in China, I will not cover, but it's here because it's also in the textbook, but it just serves as reference for you. So we have been talking that migration is also important to understand how population changes over time, not just fertility and mortality. But usually fertility and mortality have an effect on the place where the person lives right now, the place of residence. The difference with migration is that migration has an effect on the area that the person left, the area of origin, and the area that the person moved to, the area of destination. Is quiz 16 going to be on chapter 9? The quiz that it's going to be open today from 4:30, someone asked in the chat. The quiz that's going to be open today at 4:30 is going to be about internal migration. All right. Unlike the former events, the event of migration may occur on multiple occasions or never happen during a lifetime. But you could say the same thing about fertility, because some women can have more than one child, or some women could never have any children, right? Migration, based on this Lee work from 1966, is pretty much defined as a permanent or semi-permanent change of residence. No restriction is based upon the distance of the move or upon the voluntary and involuntary nature. In the US, internal migration, it's only considered internal migration if someone moves from one county to the other. If there is a change of counties, if you move within a county, technically, in the US Census Bureau does not recognize that as internal migration. But I'm doing a research about internal migration in the US using restricted data from the Census Bureau that has more refined information about where people live, that we can even actually know what's the block group that the person lives. And if that person moves from one block group to another block group. In that case, technically it's not migration, because usually when people move within counties, it's more related to economic mobility. People moving more from poor areas to better, richer areas, or vice versa. Right? It has to do either with downward or upward mobility. And now this chapter, we are focused on internal migration. The previous one, we talked about international migration. And every actor of migration involves an origin and destination, and distance, it's one intervening obstacle. Farther away areas, we have lower chances of migrating between those areas. So migration is a permanent change of residence, moving a great enough distance that all activities are transferred from one place to the other. International migrants between countries, either legally or without documents. Internal migrants move within national boundaries. Usually there is no constraint, but the whole discussion at the end of the chapter about China is that the Chinese government actually asked residents from rural areas to get a permission from the federal government to move to urban areas. If these people don't have a permission from the government to move from rural to urban areas, they still can find out a way to go to urban areas, but they will not have access to formal jobs. They will not have access to educational system to their children, to health benefits or anything. So a lot of those people still move from rural to urban areas because they will get better jobs, but their families, they leave them behind in rural areas because otherwise their children would not be able to go to school or get health benefits. So in some countries, there is constraint for people to move within the country. Permanence in migration usually means that we have been gone at least 1 year from one place to the other. Like I mentioned, in the US Census Bureau defines a migrant as a person who moved to a different county within the US. But if we are trying to understand the demand that a specific school district is going to have, how many children will demand a spot in a specific school, from the point of view of the policymaker that's trying to plan the supply of places in schools for children, it would be good to know if people are moving between school districts. And we know that in the same county, we can have different school districts. So in this case, a migrant will be someone moving into or out of school districts, even though these school districts could be within a county. So it depends on your research question. So the permanent movement of people from one place to another usually happened as a response to resource scarcity in the area of origin, typically caused by population growing, and then you have relative resources and people move to other areas. And the migration transition, whenever you're talking about migration transition and with this concept of internal migration, it's usually related to the discussion about urban transition, people moving from rural to urban areas. And this thing about resources scarcity, population get bigger and fewer jobs for them and moving to other areas, it's really related to that neoclassical theory that we discussed before. I mentioned before that in migration, there is like these two terms that are important, migration flows and migration stocks. Migration flow is the process of people moving from one place to another within a specific time period. So people moving from one place to another within a specific time interval. And its stock is after all these different years and decades, how many migrants are living in a specific area of destination, and how they did transform that area of destination and also the area of origin that lost these migrants. So there's a transformation caused in the areas of origin and destination as people move into and out of given areas. Amount of migrants in areas of origin and destination at a specific time after previous population flows. So population flows as how many people migrated, for example, from California to Texas between 2015 and 2020. That's migration flow. Migration stock, now in 2020, how many people who were born in California are now living in Texas? So I don't care about like when they arrived in Texas. Now in 2020, how many live here that were born in California? That's migration stock. If I'm talking about migration between 2015 and 2020, between California and Texas, trying to count for that specific time period, that's migration flow. And overall, there are all these different characteristics that make people more likely to migrate. Those could be individual characteristics, household characteristics, or community characteristics. And they all influence our positive factors that motivate us to migrate, or they actually create some costs and constraints that break us, that diminishes our motivation to migrate. And just how strong are the benefits in comparison to the costs will make us more likely to want to migration and then finally migrating from one area to the other. So the propensity influences the motivation that motivates the final decision to migrate, right? We talked before in the chapter about fertility, about the proximate determinants of fertility. We have these major changes that are going on in society. The social, economic, demographic, cultural, religious, contextual factors. And in the case of fertility, they affect the chances of women being married, using contraceptive methods, engaging in sexual activities, having access to abortion, what are the chances of them having postpartum infertility, and so on. Here in migration, this paper by Martin Bell and his colleagues also emphasizes that these contextual factors kind of influence some determinants that are closely related to our chances of migrating. So there are some social, economic, demographic, cultural, religious factors that will influence the time in which we enter education. In this case, I'm talking about college education. When I complete education, when I finish college, I will tend to move away from the area where I'm studying. When I enter and when I find a job, I will tend to move to the area where I found a job. When I get married, when I have children, if I get divorced, when children leave the household, and when I get retired, these are all factors that are closely related to the chances of migrating. And these proximate determinants that influence the chance of migrating, they vary by age. So, internal migration is a geographical move resulting in a change of residence that cross a political or jurisdictional boundary. In the US, this boundary is usually taken as the county. People move from county to county, but I just mentioned, for example, the school district could be an interesting area of analysis if I'm a policymaker wanting to see what's the demand of school spots in specific school districts by children. Over time, internal migration is a story pretty much of rural population growth leading to a bigger population in those areas, so people look for jobs and better life in other places. And when the population is almost entirely urban, people move between urban places. So people move from bigger cities to mid-sized cities, from downtown areas to suburbs, even maybe crossing county boundaries. And this is usually the case for more developed countries such as the US and Western Europe. When you start to have this more complexity in internal migration flows, it's pretty much what's called the process of migration evolution. It's not so simple as migration from urban to rural areas. There is a lot of migration between urban areas. Any person who changes his or her residence is a mover, but not all movers are migrants because a person can move within the same community without involving the cross of a political boundary. All migrants are movers because the residential movement of a migrant involves the move of at least a county level jurisdiction boundary. So just really using the US Census Bureau formal definition. The Census Bureau demographers have estimated that a person in the US may move around 12 times in one's lifetime on average, changing from residence from one county to the other. Why it's important to understand migration? Because migration has impact on receiving and sending communities, has consequences on the society. The donor area, the area that loses migrants, the area of origin, typically loses young adults, which can slow down population growth in those areas. And the host area that receives these migrants gains those young adults, which can increase population growth and increase the proportion of the youth population in those areas. And areas that receive a lot of migrants, and usually they are more in labor ages, those migrants, even if they are internal migrants, they can send money back into the areas of origin, which are called remittances, and remittances have an impact on the areas of origin as well. So migrants have an effect on the area of destination, but also on areas of origin. And some more concepts related to migration. A permanent residential move, either local jurisdiction, is usually defined as a change of residence that lasts at least 1 year. The residential migration of persons moving into an area of destination is called in-migration, and the migration of persons leaving an area of origin is known as out-migration. So let's go back to the example. People moving from California to Texas between 2015 and 2020. If my analysis is focusing on the effects of these migrants here in Texas, I want to know the effects of these migrants in Texas, I'm doing an analysis of in-migration. If I'm doing an analysis on the other point of view, how these people leaving, getting out of California might affect positively or negatively the economy in California, I'm doing an analysis of the consequences of out-migration in the state of California. And also, we can have return migration. It is possible that a migrant might move back to one's area of origin at the end of their life course. And that happens even in internal migration, right? Someone moves from their state or city of birth in the US, go get a college degree somewhere, get a job somewhere else, establish a family, and then their children get out of the household. After they retire, they might go back to the state where they were born because they might still have relatives and some social network going on there. So there is this return migration, even in the context of internal migration as well, not just international migration. And these terms are important. We already talked about this before. When we are talking about internal migration, in the point of view of the destination areas, we are talking about in-migration. Point of view of sending areas, out-migration. And these terms for international migrations are immigration and emigration. This measure of migration, called net migration, you pretty much count how many people moved into a specific area and subtract by the number of people who left that area. So that's net migration. The net migration could be positive, more in-migrants relative to out-migrants. It could be negative, more out-migrants in relation to in-migrants, or a net balance leaning towards zero when these two numbers are similar. But let's say that I want to know how dynamic is a specific society. Maybe one state receives 2 million people every year, and that state also loses overall 2 million people. If we just calculate net migration, that number will lean towards zero. But that's a really dynamic state that's gaining 2 million people and losing 2 million people every year. So in order to see this overall move of people, a better measure would be gross migration. That I just added the 2 million immigrants to the 2 million out migrants to kind of show, wow, there are 4 million people moving in or moving out from a specific state. So there is a lot of migration dynamic going on in that area. Migration efficiency is pretty much when we divide net migration by gross migration. And when we divide net migration by gross migration, we get migration efficiency. And we say that migration is positively efficient for an area when there has been a lot of in-migration and little out-migration. Negatively efficient when there has been a lot of out-migration and little in-migration, and inefficient when the overall number of immigrants and out-migrants are about the same. And when you divide that by the gross migration, that number is going to be close to zero. So that migration is pretty much inefficient in the sense of it doesn't change the size of the population that much, right? The term migration stream is a group of migrants having a common area of origin or a common area of destination during a specified migration interval. So there are a lot of people moving to southern states more recently, for example, to Texas. A counter-esteem, it's the opposite migration from in this case, I just mentioned, a lot of people moving from the Northeast to Texas would be migration from Texas to the Northeast. And the counter-stream is usually smaller in size, and it's just pretty much looking at the opposite way. We usually hear more about that in international migration. For example, we hear about migration from Latin America to the US, but that we also have a migration from the US to Latin America as the counter stream, and overall, it's a smaller in size. A migration interval is a temporal dimension of migration divided by the researcher. It's pretty much the time of two events. Usually when we get information from censuses, we are getting migration from 5 years ago to the current time. When we use information from the American Community Survey, it's information about where did you live 1 year ago, where you are living right now. So this migration interval in surveys, such as the American Community Survey, is 1 year. In censuses, it's usually 5 years. But the US does not ask the question about migration in the census anymore. The census is a really short questionnaire. The last time that it was asked a question, the long questionnaire in the census was in 2000. So it was 5 years ago. In the 2010 census already, the questionnaire was smaller. And the migration question is just asked in the American Community Survey every year, and more systematic since 2005. And it's the main question is, where did you live 1 year ago? But you also have information about state of birth or country of birth that can give even different migration intervals as well. What's interesting for us to see is the analysis of differences in migrant populations according to their demographic, social, and economic characteristics. What is the educational attainment or race ethnicity composition of migrants moving from one area to the other? And why specific people migrate more from one area to the other? There is a lot of migration selectivity. Not everyone has the same chances of staying in their place of birth and moving out of their place of birth. There is a selectivity process. And we saw that a lot in international migration. In the migration from Mexico to the US, we mentioned the selectivity process that's related to the Hispanic health paradox. Usually the healthier people on average from Mexico move to the US because they are stronger physically and mentally, and they move from Mexico to the US. And also those who move back, usually we have the Salmon bias effect that we also discussed, in which people, when they're getting older ages, they're about to die, they decide to move back to their home country. And that happens a lot from the US to Mexico. So migration selectivity is related to age, race, sex, socioeconomic status, and other demographic characteristics. So whenever we are trying to understand the reasons of migration, we have to include in our analysis all these different variations of migration rates by all these different characteristics. Age and education are great predictors of migration. Americans aged 18 to 24 are more likely to move due to events because of initiating college or getting a job, right? That's what's going to happen to Patrick at the end of the semester when he graduates from the university. He's not even listening to me. Hey, Patrick. Yeah, he's really looking at the election at this point. So he still didn't hear. Selectivity by push and pull factors. I was talking to you, man. I was talking to you. Yeah, so just watch the recording afterwards. So migrants, they can be positively or negatively selected. They are positively selected when the reason that they migrate is because the area of destination has really good characteristics, job opportunities, and so on, that attract these people to those areas. So because the US has good job opportunities, life opportunities for people here, has economic growth, higher unemployment rate compared to other places. I'm not talking about the specific issues that we are facing during the pandemic now that really made employment rates to drop a lot. But usually the US has really good job opportunities, life conditions that attract these people. So these immigrants that are attracted by these good conditions, they are usually positively selected. Positively select, what does it mean? That on average, they have good health outcomes, they have good education outcomes, they have good occupational skills. And migrants tend to be negatively selected when the areas of origin are facing economic stagnation, violence, poverty, and those areas kind of make people move away from them. So when these areas have all these economic issues, social issues, and unrest, then people with lower levels of education, worse health outcomes, all these people, they tend to move away. These migrants are less likely to have higher socioeconomic status than those responding to the pull factors, that the ones that I mentioned before. And this is a graph related to those, the proximate determinants of migration. See, it's the same study. If you just go back there into the proximate determinants of migration, the life course transitions, entry into education, education completion, labor force entry, union formation, childbearing, all these different transitions that happen in our life, they make us more or less likely to migrate. They are related to the migration rates by age. So if you go to that graph, you see that in a graph format. So you see here, children, usually the migration rates of children, they mirror the migration rates of their parents, that this one's here. In this case here is not so, the slope is not so similar in this specific example. But as people get older, above the age of 15, and start entering college, and they enter college, higher education, their chances of moving within the country increases. When they finish college and look for a job and find a job, also their chances of moving to other areas within the country is really high. After they find a job and they get married, their life starts to be more stabilized, their chances of migrating declines. Having a child, also, they tend to stay in the same place. They might change jobs, but still stay in the same county where they live. And when their children leave the home, if you look at the rates of these children, it starts to increase because their children are going to college, but they are just staying usually in the same place. When these people here retire, then you might see a little bit of increase on the chances of migrating. And in really older ages, they might move to institutions to get that provide elderly care. So you might see some increases in these migration rates here as well, but this is harder to capture because the population size is really small here. But you see these life course transitions. This is really related to that diagram about proximate determinants of migration. Education, people entering college, finish college, getting a job, and then life starts to be more stable. The chances of migration declines. And if we look at real data, and this is data from around 2012 for China, Portugal, and Brazil, you will still see those overall shapes, but you see that in some cases, the these rates are more concentrated, strongly concentrated in specific ages. So I just mentioned to you in the case of China, migration in China, internal migration in China. You have to get the approval from the government to move from rural to urban area in order to get access to formal labor market, to take your children to public schools and have access to healthcare. If you don't have that approval, then usually male workers tend to move, or female workers as well, but the children stay behind. So you see that these people migrate, but no children is following them. These rates here do not mirror the rates of their parents. And you see that this migration from China is at younger ages than in Portugal and in Brazil, because these are people moving from rural to urban areas in China, looking for higher education. And once they stay there, they get a job, and then their chances to migrate again declines. In Portugal, usually people move, the highest chances of migrating is a little older, so usually when people finish college, and then the chances of migrating declines among people that start to have a more stabilized life. And the rates of these parents here kind of mirrors the rates of these children. So these are children migrating with their parents. And you see in Portugal in later ages, people migrating more and exactly moving to those institutions that take care of the elderly population, or moving to relatives' house that will take care of them. And in Brazil, the concentration among the highest age, this age with the highest migration rate, is not so concentrated as you saw in Portugal and China. And the rates here of children tend to follow more the rates of their parents. But overall, the rates of migration are not so strongly defined. The migration rates are not so strongly defined by age, as it was in Portugal and China in these examples. This is the case of the US. Migration rates also by age. This is migration from 2008 to 2009. And based on the total population is the dark red line. And based on household, the whole household moving, the household counted just as one, the pink line. And what you see here, what's the most different is in older ages, exactly some people having higher chance of migrating at older ages, exactly those people moving to institutions or moving to relatives' houses when they get at older ages that they need more care. But the overall households, the chance of migrating is not so high, right? And now I'm going to discuss a little more about measures of migration. There are some difficulties in measure migration that are not encountered when we analyze fertility or mortality. Usually births and deaths, they are registered at the time that they happen. So births are registered with like birth certificate. Deaths are registered with the death certificate. In most countries, the residential move of a person is not registered at the time of occurrence. Some countries like China and Scandinavian countries have administration system, registration systems that the government actually knows people moving within the countries. But usually migration, for most of the countries, we have to rely on other types of data. We usually rely on surveys and on census data in order to capture migration, both internal and international. Migration data in the US, as I was mentioning before, nowadays we have been using a lot the American Community Survey, the ACS, and we basically can take advantage of two questions that are available now at the Community Survey that were previously part of the decennial censuses. The decennial census up to 2000 also asked those questions here, but after 2000, those questions are asked only in the American Community Survey. state of birth, and place of residence 1 year prior to the date of the ACS. When this question was asked in the census, it was place of residence 5 years prior to the date of the census. So up to the 2000 census, you had this question. And after the 2000 census, that's not asked more in the census. So 2010 and 2020 census do not ask these questions. And this is just asked in the long form questionnaire of the American Community Survey. Because up to the 2000 census, you had the short form that was asked to the whole population, and you had the long form that was asked to 5% of the households in the US. But overall, these are the two main questions that the ACS measures. In the US also, there is some administrative data that we can take advantage of. The Internal Revenue Service has data from tax returns that when we file a tax return, we write really detailed information about ourselves, name, social security number, and place of residence. So if we file the tax returns every year, it's possible to use that data to know where we were in all these different years. So this is administrative data, not capturing information exactly the date in which you moved, like Scandinavian countries have, like China has, but kind of being able to measure that once a year. And data that you can link people over time because of social security number. We can use different variables in order to say if a person is a migrant or not, in order to say whether the person, or in order to generate a variable to migration status, to measure migration status. We can say, oh, a migrant is going to be someone that was born in another state. So we can use only this variable here to measure that. And we can use the information about where the person lives right now and where the person was born before in order to create this measure of migration status. Or I can get the place of residence 1 year before based on the ACS and the place of residence right now to kind of measure the migration in more recent years. So in the ACS, if I get the information about where the person lives right now, here, let's say the 2018 ACS, the latest available, and it has information about the place of residence in 2017. So I know the migration from 2017 to 18. But let's say that I still know the place of residence in 2018, but the state of birth of these people. So I know the migration from the time that all these people were born, which were in different years, and where they live right now. So I can create different measures of migration. One way to do it, a migration category example. I can say that someone is a non-migrant, someone is a native, if that person is living in a specific state and the person was born in that same state. A lifetime migrant, someone who is living in a given state but was born somewhere else, and was born in a given state but living in some other state right now. So the lifetime migrant is more this long-term migration. I was born somewhere else some years ago, decades ago, and now I'm living in the current residence. That's a lifetime migration. Recent migrants, I use this information here, place of residence 1 year ago. These are people who moved into the state or the current residence within the past 1 year using the American Community Survey, or 5 years using the census. So I can categorize people by these three groups here. Let's say that someone was born in New York, and then that person throughout their life moved to California, and now is living in Texas. And moved from California to Texas from 2019 to 2020. So that person would be a recent migrant. But if we did that exercise before, and that person had moved to California from New York 20, 30 years ago, that person would be a lifetime migrant in California. So these concepts of migration can get kind of complicated and tricky, but just to show that depending on the questions that you have about people, where they lived, for how long they lived in a specific state, you can get more refined information. So there are different ways to categorize migrants based on the data that the American Community Survey gives us, for example. And people could move from and back a state several times between birth and the time of enumeration. So we have to have cautious with migration. Someone could have been born in Texas, left to another state, and is back in Texas. So that person will count as a non-migrant, because you could say, oh, no, last year I was in Texas. I was born in Texas, so I'm a non-migrant. But maybe that person left 5 years ago to another state, came back 4 years ago, but the data doesn't capture that movement. So we have to be cautious with that. The same caution applies to measuring migration 5 years prior to the enumeration, right? Because we could say, oh no, I was born in Texas. 5 years ago, I was in Texas, and now I am in Texas. So I'm a non-migrant. But let's say that 20 years ago, I left, came back 15 years ago, but to all these other questions that the census and the ACS captures, my status is going to be a non-migrant. So these questions, they have a lot of limitations, that we cannot capture all the movements that people did throughout their lives. These are some of the rates and ratios in migration that we can estimate. In migration rate, we get the number of people that entered a specific country, and technically the denominator here is the population of the country that, or the state that the person entered, the area that the person entered. Out migration is the number of people who left a specific area divided by the population of that area that they left. In demographic terms, what's the most correct rate of migration among these two here that I just explained? In migration or out migration rate? Out migration. Because what is usually the denominator of a formula in demography? What is the denominator? The population that it's at risk of getting into the numerator, of experiencing the event that we are measuring in the numerator. So the population in the area of origin has a chance of getting out and coming to the numerator. But the population in the area of destination, it's already in the destination area. So that person cannot be an in-migrant because that person is already in the destination area. But this rate here is easier to estimate, because I just go to that specific area, count how many people entered there in the last year, divided by the population of that area. It's easier. This one is more difficult, because I have to be in a specific area where people left. The denominator is the population of that area that people left. But I have to go to all these different states and see, oh, people who were living in this area 1 year ago, and now they are living in all these different areas. So this one is more difficult to calculate, but is the most appropriate in demography. You understand the logic? Because the denominator is the number of people who have a chance to enter the numerator. And since this population here is the population in the area of origin, these are people at risk of getting out. The population in the area of destination are not at risk of going into that area because they already live there, right? But that's an easier measure of migration, taking into account the size of population in the area of destination. Net migration rate is number of in-migrants minus out-migrants divided by the population. Again, the most correct population of the areas of origin. Gross migration, the same idea as I talked before. In migration plus out migration divided by population, in the most appropriate population of the area of origin. And all of them multiplied by 1,000 because these numbers get really small. And the migration efficiency ratio is pretty much net migration divided by gross migration, as we mentioned before. And the migration efficiency ratio is measured in percentage terms, right? Multiplied by 100. And here we are talking about I refers to the number of in-migrants, O number of out-migrants, and P is the denominator of migration rates. And refers to the mid-year or average size of the population of the resident area. And the most appropriate denominator of these formulas here would be the population of the area of origin, right? The out-migration rate is analogous to the crude death rate because these are population that this specific area is losing. The in-migration rate is analogous to the crude birth rate because this is a population that area is gaining. And the net migration rate is analogous to the rate of natural increase and natural decrease. Natural increase and decrease is pretty much the crude birth rate minus the crude death rate. The net migration rate is the same idea. In-migration rate minus the out-migration rate. And this is just to give an idea of migration flows. Number of in-migrants in California, out-migrants in California. Gross migrants is pretty much in and out, California, Nevada, New York, and Texas. And net migration is in minus out. So California, New York has been losing more people based on data from 2004 and 5. And Nevada and Texas gaining more people than losing. And the migration measures, we pretty much get number of in-migrants divided by the population of destination. We have the in-migration rate. Out-migration rates, this one here is the numerator, divided by the population of areas of origin, by the area of origin, which is California, Nevada, and New York. And the gross migration rate is this one divided by the population, the denominator, net migration divided by the population, and the gross migration, the net migration divided by the gross migration rate times 100 is the migration efficiency ratio, right? Which is exactly those rates and ratios that we mentioned before. And these ones here are called rates, remember, because this population, the denominator, technically, at least technically, has a chance of going to the numerator. I just explained that this is not true for in-migration. But the migration efficiency is not a rate, it's a ratio because we are comparing two different numbers. The net migration, the gross migration. The gross migration doesn't have a chance to go to the net migration. These are two different measures that we are trying to compare their sizes. So that's why it's called the migration efficiency ratio. And that's this last one here. And then going into examples of internal migration in the US. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, there was a steady stream of migration setting in the western areas beyond the Mississippi River. Between the late 1800s and 1960s, the South had been the major exporter of people. Since the 1970s, the major interregional migration flows within the US have been from east to west and from north to south. And when we are talking about these areas, we're talking about this. This is the West region, Midwest, Northeast, and the South, right? And and you have the divisions within them, but this analysis here, I'm just talking about more the overall regions. And just looking at the regional migration patterns, internal migration between these regions, in the period from 1970 to 2010. The South has been the only region to have continuously experienced positive net migration. The West region has moved from positive to negative and is slightly positive again in more recent years. The South and West were popular destinations, particularly among graduate degree holders who were 25 years or older. In the Midwest and Northeast regions have continuously had negative migration. This explanation here is exactly the explanation of this graph. So this is domestic migration, that's net migration. So the South always positive from 1970 to 2010. The West positive, became negative in 1995, and then is slightly positive now again. And the Midwest and the Northeast have been always experiencing more people getting out of those areas than moving in. During the Great Migration is an important period to understand about internal migration in the US. The Great Migration happened between 1910 and 1970. Over 6 million Blacks moved out of the rural South to the Midwest, Northeast, and Pacific Coast. Almost 90% of African Americans were living in the South in the 1900s. By 1970, the states of New York, Illinois, and California had received large numbers of African Americans. And then I get data from another article, and also the next graphs, the next maps as well, to kind of show this African American Great Migration, explain a little more. The African American Great Migration from the South to the North happened during the 20th century. African Americans were pretty much just looking better socioeconomic opportunities for their families by going to the North. This migration contributed to social, economic, demographic, and cultural transformation of cities in the north of the US. And in this graph here, we just see the trends of African Americans in non-southern areas. The columns, pretty much the total number of African Americans living in non-southern areas overall, even those that were born in non-southern states. And this black line are those African Americans who were born in southern states, but are now living somewhere else. So these are really clear internal migrants, that they were born in southern states and they moved into non-southern areas. This one here includes their children and other African Americans that were born already in non-southern states. And here's the Great Migration between 1916 and 1930, in the first half of that period that we are talking about. So you had these major migration corridors from the Southwest to Midwest and to Far West, as we see here, from South Central to Midwest, and from the Southeast to the Northeast. And as you start to have more people moving, get to know about all the areas, it becomes more than destination areas are seen. So now you start to see people moving also to the Northwest US. If you compare the previous graph to this one, you see more areas of destination, areas of origin and destination as well, right? Whites also moved to the north in large numbers in the same period. However, they did not experience disadvantaged positions as blacks in the South. So the reasons of whites moving from the South to the North was different. Segregation and concentration of poverty in the growing northern ghettos limited the residential mobility of African Americans. So African Americans were moving from southern areas to northern areas, looking for better job opportunities, better life conditions, less discrimination, but still they were segregating, concentrated in areas with low socioeconomic status. So this overall historical process has to be understood in order to further investigate Black migration and mobility. And that's an issue that we even today we talk about. African Americans experience a lot of issues in Chicago and some other areas in Midwest as well, right? So that's still all related to this historical process. After the Great Migration, changes contributed to the desire of Black inner city residents to relocate to suburbs and to better neighborhoods within the North. So of course, African Americans are now living in all different areas within these urban cities, in the suburbs as well. It's much more dynamic. It's not just Blacks living in inner cities. It's a much more heterogeneous group than some politicians usually say. Cross-generation familial and cultural connections contributed to some of them returning to the South. But this return to the South only happened after changes took place in the South towards more socioeconomic, political equality for Blacks. And then return migration became more attractive to them. So after the 70s, we see a reversal migration. Younger, college-educated migrants moving to a more prosperous and post-civil rights South. So, for example, Texas is attracting a lot of migrants within the country. Cities and metro areas of Atlanta, Dallas, and Houston are among the most popular destinations for whites, Blacks, and also new immigrant minorities. And today, young adults are more likely to move than anyone else, exactly because they are looking for school, for higher education, college, looking for jobs, and getting married, and that makes them move to other cities. And people who are at least 40 years of age are much less likely to move. Older people are more likely to stay in a specific area. So a lot of these people in Midwestern states in the US, those areas are seeing a lot of like economic stagnation, people losing jobs, but usually because those people are older, their chances of getting out of there, even if they experience issues of finding good jobs, it's lower. So the chances of them getting out is lower, even if they don't have as many good employment opportunities over there. Exactly because age counts against them in this case. Highly educated people are more likely to migrate. The farther they move, the more likely education will play a major role in the decision of moving. Usually better educated people moving more into farther away states than people with lower levels of education. White-collar workers are the most mobile occupation group. Farm and service workers are the least mobile. Manual workers are more likely to move locally. They usually have lower levels of education as well. And people who are not in the labor force are also more likely to migrate because they try to find jobs somewhere else. And after people, so we are talking about factors that are influencing migration: age, education, occupation. And after people move, what are the consequences of migrating, right? The decision to migrate is likely reached when advantage of moving to destination outweighs this advantage of staying. And these population movements have effects on both places of origin and destination, as I have been emphasizing in the class today. And they affect both the migrants and the non-migrants of areas that they left and the areas that they are moving to. And this is true even for small or large population flows. The effect of moving for an individual migrant differs from the effect of an aggregate migrant population. So maybe me moving to another area will increase my overall earnings from me or from a household. But maybe it will increase competition in the labor market in that specific area for the destination, which might create some negative effects. So these individual and contextual effects might be different. That's why migration is such a complex process. A major effect of migration to an individual migrant, whether social, economic, political, or physical characteristics of a new environment, are more favorable or preferable than those of previous residents. So what are the reasons of why a specific individual migrant move? Because all these characteristics here of areas of destination is better from my point of view than the area that I was living before. But those preferences of actually moving depend on migrants' personal observation experiences, where the migrant possesses the right skills to adapt to the new area, and whether the migrant is readily accepted. In the US, internal migration, it's usually more accepted, but you might still see racist minority groups when they move to areas that have lower proportion of minority groups not being well accepted in those areas. That still exists a lot, of course. And what are the effects of aggregate migration? The area of origin is affected by the number and type of migrants moving out of the area. A large out-migration will significantly affect an area's potential population growth. For instance, if the net migration rate is highly negative and the population staying is largely elderly, that will affect a lot the area of origin. And in that case, it could be in a negative way because the population staying is elderly and they will have a lower chance of being working and the area of origin will be less economic productive. There are two ways that immigration contributes to the increase of population in the area of destination. Pretty much the number of immigrants moving to that area, that's the direct effect. And when immigrants move to those areas, they will have children. So the children of immigrants is the indirect effect. In international migration, we talked about this before. We call this direct effect the first generation immigrants. The indirect effect, the second generation immigrants. But this direct and indirect effect also happens in internal migration. What is the magnitude of these effects? The magnitude of direct effects depends on the relative size of these migrants moving from one area to the other compared to the receiving population. And the magnitude of the indirect effect depends on the fertility levels of migrants. Though these internal migrants have more children than the receiving population, then the indirect effect will be high, right? It's the same idea of international migration. The first generation immigrants will have an impact in the destination if the destination has a small population. The second generation immigrants will have an impact if the fertility of first generation is higher than the fertility of US-born population. So you're going to have more children of immigrants than children of people from that specific area. And this slide here is pretty much a summary of the short interview that demographer William Frey, he is a major demographer in the US that deals a lot with changes in race, ethnicity, composition in the country, and also migration. And this link here is available in our course website. And he has been mentioning that the US has been experiencing the lowest levels of internal migration since the late 1940s. It was 20% back in 1950s and 60s, and he mentions that the economy was robust at that time, which influenced the migration, but it declined to less than 10% in 2019. The reasons for decline: now we have an older population. Older people have lower chances of migrating. Labor market is more homogeneous across country. I can find good jobs in all different areas in the US because these labor markets are more homogeneous. The 2008 economic recession actually prevented people to move from one area to the other. They tend to stay in specific areas because of all the issues that they experience. And this interview was before the pandemic. So because of the pandemic now, that's creating an economic recession even stronger than 2008. Based on his analysis, these internal migration rates will decline even further in these next few years. And telecommuting and jobs from home, which was already a reality 1 year ago, nowadays we are getting much more used to telecommuting and doing jobs from home. So this pandemic now will have also effects on internal migration in the country, as the 2008 economic recession had. And because this pandemic is also related to telecommuting and jobs from home. And he was mentioned that he would hope that internal migration would increase to maybe around 12% a year. But because of the pandemic, that might not happen, right? This specific interview, it's on our course website. And if you just go population and society, and you go to the topic on internal migration, his interview is this one here. And the article that he wrote is this one here, article at the Brookings Institutions. For the first time on record, fewer than 10% of Americans move in a year. That's a short article, easy to read. And the interview that I summarized on that slide is here. And these are some other material, more like methodological to estimate migration rates. So for our next exam, this coming Thursday, it will cover up to this topic of domestic migration in the US. So it will not cover these two parts here. And on Tuesday next week, I will finish this and then go to race ethnicity chapter. This part here is just extra, will not cover in the classroom. Okay, so let's just all try to keep our anxiety levels controlled for the result of the election. I guess everybody's going to try to follow the results now. And yeah, try to study as much as you can for the exam. It will be available from 1 p.m. to 8 p.m. on Thursday. As soon as we started on Canvas, you're going to have 1 hour and 15 minutes to answer the 50 multiple choice questions. Thank you very much, and I see you in the class again 1 week from now on Tuesday. Thank you.